Okay, let's dive in. Let's have a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you that in this special season there are reminders everywhere of your presence with us, but we are reminded always at all times by the gentle urging of your Spirit and by the word that we encounter in Scripture and by the encouragement and joy that we find in our friends in the life of the church that you are with us always. Come and be with us now to interpret this word that we will read and study. Encourage us and strengthen us, correct us and guide us, so that we might live in the way of Jesus today. For his sake, amen. Okay, we are going to talk about Corinthians one more time in 2024, and then not until 2025 will we come back to 1 Corinthians. So January 8th will be our first session back with each other. January 1st is a Wednesday, and none of us want to do anything with the church on New Year's Day. So other than pray and say to God, how in the world did you give me a whole nother year? I'm still here, right? So January 8th is when we'll be back. Let us go ahead and read together chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians, and then we'll start to take it apart. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, and they were struck down in the wilderness. Now, these things occurred as examples for us, so that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not become idolaters, as some of them did. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents. And do not complain, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. These things happened to them to serve as an example, and they were written down to instruct us, on whom the ends of the ages have come. So if you think you are standing, watch out that you do not fall. No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tested beyond your strength. But with the testing, he will also provide the way out, so that you may be able to endure it. Therefore, my dear friends, flee from the worship of idols. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a sharing in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a sharing in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices partners in the altar? What do I imply then? That food sacrificed to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be partners with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of the demons. Or are we provoking the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? All things are lawful, but not all things are beneficial. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Do not seek your own advantage, but that of the other. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience, for the earth and its fullness are the Lord's. If an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, out of consideration for the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. I mean the other's conscience, not your own. For why should my liberty be subject to the judgment of someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why should I be denounced because of that for which I give thanks? So whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do, do everything for the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, so that they may be saved. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Okay, There's a ton of stuff here. And it's not always easy to figure out because Paul is giving a whole lot of background, a whole lot of meat with every single phrase, and it's like you need 4 paragraphs of other material to go along with it to really figure out what he's talking about. But he just presumes that we know all that. So we're going to try to provide all of that background stuff. First of all, though, let's look at where we are in the context, right? Paul has been speaking at length about a problem that existed in the first century church. And it's a problem that still exists for the church, but not in exactly the same kind of immediate context. But we need to understand that problem. In chapters 8 and in chapters 9, Paul has been talking about this problem, and he's continuing the conversation here. So try to remember back to the last couple of weeks that you've been together. Here is the problem. The problem is that all of these folks who have come into the church, right, are trying to figure out if they can still participate in some of the activities, some of the social activities, some of the political activities, some of the economic activities, some of normal society and life, if they can still be part of that at all, or whether they have to give it all up. And what they're referring to specifically is the fact that in the first century world, where people worshiped all kinds of different gods, their life was characterized not just by worshiping those gods, but by all the things that flowed out of that. Let's say you were a silversmith, for instance, okay, a major industry. As a silversmith, you worshiped certain gods of silversmiths, okay? And when you gathered together to talk about business with other silversmiths, you also shared a meal, or you also participated in practices that gave honor to these gods. And so that happened in many of the industries, many of the smaller sub-societies within the larger society. There was a lot of pagan worship involved animal sacrifice, and you had all this meat that needed to be eaten. And so worship led into social activity. Social activity led into political connections, business connections, connections whereby you could find somebody to marry your daughter to. All kinds of things flowed out of the pagan worship that was going on. And so it was natural for the first century Christians to continue to participate in those things, not because they believed in idols anymore, but because that was part and parcel of the everyday fabric of life that touched lots of different parts of life. But first century Christians had a problem with that because, well, we don't believe in those idols anymore. But if I'm going to continue to do business, if I'm going to continue to be part of society, can I be part of these things or not? Okay, that's been the overarching social situation of the time. It's not merely about, well, I want to go to church on Sunday for 1 hour and then the rest of my life is just normal with everybody. That's the way we approach faith a lot today in the larger world as well. You can have your belief, read your private little devotional over here or go to a service every once in a while, but that's separate from everything else that you do in life. That's the way a lot of people look at faith today. You guys are actually better off than everybody else. And I know that because you're here on a Wednesday morning, right? And most of you here are here most Wednesday mornings, right? You know that faith involves something much more than that. It involves a totality of life. But that's a better way, actually, to get in touch with the issue that the Corinthians had, right? For those who think of faith as simply an occasional thing that's merely a private matter and doesn't touch anything else in life, it would be hard to understand what the First Corinthians problem was. So we know what the problem is. Now, in the 8th chapter, to summarize that very quickly, in the 8th chapter, that section of this letter, Paul says to the Corinthians, those of you who are strong in faith, who are really well-grounded and absolutely convinced and moving along and growing more mature in your faith, it's not a big issue for you to participate in a simple meal or something that's kind of peripheral to idolatrous worship. You're going to be okay. But you need to think about those who are not so strong in faith. There are a lot of people maybe that might slide back into a different way of believing, back into their old ways of beliefs. They might slide back into ways of acting with each other because of their association with this old life. And so, out of respect and out of concern for the tender nature of their spiritual health, then perhaps you should think about not participating in these things so you don't lead somebody else astray. That's his answer to that question in chapter 8. In chapter 9, he goes even further with that question. He says, those of you who are strong spiritually and know that you are freed from any idea of there being all of these pagans, you are free from all of the weird superstitions and the things that flow out of that kind of lifestyle. He said, you need to give up that freedom to be part of everything that's going on. You need to voluntarily give that up sometimes. Some of the Corinthians were saying, we don't have to worry about any of that stuff anymore. We can do whatever we want to because we're spiritually strong. And Paul says, well, if you are spiritually strong, out of concern for those who are not, then you need to be able to give up some of that freedom that you have. It's not that you're not still free. You are willingly laying that down sometimes in order to care for and strengthen and nurture the faith of other folks. That's his answer in chapter 9. Remembering that the chapters are not there. Paul is actually giving a very long answer, and we're going to continue talking about more of the answer that he gives today. Okay, does that make sense to you? So, it might be helpful at this point to think about something in our lives maybe that comes close to being a corollary to the nature of the situation in the church in Corinth. And the best thing I can come up with, maybe you guys can come up with something better. The best thing I can come up with is to ask this question. How many of you grew up in religious traditions that said it was sinful to drink alcohol or to dance or to play cards or to wear pants to church or all kinds of things like that, right? You know what I'm talking about there? Okay? That's still with us today. That's still with us today. And I'm certainly not denigrating any of those things. My own, the woman that I'm married to, every Sunday morning we go through this conversation about, well, it's really cold, I want to wear pants, but I know if I do, my dad would be unhappy with me. And we've been having this conversation for nearly 40 years now, and I still can't get past that, right? Sometimes, out of deference to another person's sensibility, out of concern for their feelings, right? You sit down to a meal and you know that this part of the family doesn't drink, and so nobody drinks, right? That's getting us in the direction of what we're talking about here. It's not just about a simple thing like that, though, because for the Corinthians, this was an issue of withdrawing from part of society, an important part of society. And first century Christians, and I would argue in many ways that Christians still today have some of that problem in that situation. We'll talk more about that. Now, let's talk about how Paul continues to answer this situation, okay? This very, very real and present and very serious matter for the life of the Corinthians. He goes to a place where it's kind of hard for us to figure out why, unless we know why, because it's sort of an abrupt shift in the conversation. Paul goes into a conversation about lessons to be learned from the ancient history of the Jewish people. Okay? Remember that Paul does not have the New Testament to turn to when it comes to answers for how to live as a Christian. I don't think Paul knows it, but he's helping write the New Testament, right? Paul has the scriptures. Paul has the history and tradition of the people of God, which modern-day Christians look at as Judaism, the Old Testament, right? Well, that's what Paul had. That's what the church had. And Paul uses that to teach people about how successfully to follow Christ, how to be a person within the family of God. Lots of Christians today make a very, very serious error in thinking that the Old Testament doesn't apply to them, in thinking that the Old Testament has nothing to say to them, and thinking that the history of Israel up to the point of Jesus has nothing to do with us. That's disastrous, actually. Because here you have the Apostle Paul appealing to truth that is taught through the history of the Jewish people, right? Because they are simply the people of God. Paul does not make a sharp distinction between Jew and Christian in this sense. He sees it all as the people of God. And now those who follow Jesus are merely following the new Messiah, right? It's one thing. He doesn't draw that sharp line. He says there's nothing there. And so we need to learn that history as well. So what does Paul do? He goes back to the story of the Exodus and the wandering in the wilderness. So it's a good thing that we have studied Genesis and Exodus in here just in the last couple of years, because all of this stuff is right there at your fingertips, right? What happened in the Exodus? God, through Moses, led the people out of slavery in Egypt, and then he led them through 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And Paul mentions that here. He says, right? Our ancestors were under the cloud that led the people by day. They all passed through the sea, right? Going through the Red Sea, then the Jordan River. All were baptized into Moses. All drank the same spiritual drink, ate the same spiritual food. He's thinking of manna and the water that came from the rock, not just as physical sustenance, but as spiritual sustenance, as a way of saying, God is here taking care of you. In all of those ways, Paul is saying to the first century church now, 1,500 years after these events happened, he said, this is part of your history. This is who you are. God takes care of you. There's a couple of fascinating things that happen with this. Not only is Paul teaching Christians, and still teaching us, out of this ancient history, he is teaching Gentiles about Jewish history. And he is saying, you are incorporated into this family. This is part of your history. Now, this has worked successfully with La Costa Glen. It worked with the men this morning, so there's a lot of pressure on you, okay? I'm going to ask you this question. Do any of you come from a family that has a very strong sense of tradition and history of the family itself, where your family name and the history of your family is a big deal? Do any of you come from families like that? Okay, what's your family name? Family name is Burkhalter, okay? That's great. I'm going to make some assumptions here. You just tell me if they're right. I would say for the Burkhalter family, there's a strong knowledge. There's a lot of knowledge about ancestors that have come before. There's probably a lot of family pictures. There's some family Bibles. There's stories of successful Burkhalters. We won't talk about the stories of the horse thieves and all that stuff, right? Okay. There's a strong sense growing up as a Burkhalter that you're part of a tradition that you must maintain and uphold, and you take a lot of your identity from the Burkhalters, right? Is that all true, what I just said? Excellent, excellent. Okay. Now, let's say this worked well the last two, and it's going to work well this one, okay? I'm not a Burkhalter. There ain't nothing in me that's Burkhalter, okay? Let's say, though, that I want to become a Burkhalter. Okay, will you adopt me into the Burkhalter family? Good answer, thank you. That was risky right there, okay? How can I become a Burkhalter? There's nothing in me that is Burkhalter, right? But if I'm going to become a Burkhalter, then what I need to do is adopt the family history. I need to learn that history. I need to take it as my own. I need to adopt that identity, right? Paul is saying, especially to the Gentile Christians now, you have adopted this identity. This history, even though there's no actual literal link, there are no family names, there's no biology, there's no literal link between you and this history, there is a spiritual link, and it is the controlling thing in your life now. This is who you are. Paul, for the Jewish Christians, it would be an easy thing. It would be easy to say, yeah, this is our family, this is our history, we know these lessons. For the Gentiles, it would make no sense whatsoever. But spiritually speaking, it makes all the sense in the world. Paul has already made the case and will continue to make the case that Jew or Greek, Gentile, male or female, slave or free, none of that stuff means anything anymore. It's all about your identity in Christ Jesus. You are adopted into this history, into this family, and that is determinative. That determines who you are. And here's a case where he supports that idea. Okay? So by saying that, Paul is continuing, remember, he's continuing to answer the question of whether or not we can eat meals with the pagans and participate in some of pagan society, even though we are Christian now, right? Why does he go back to these old stories? He's helping the Christians remember who they are now. It wasn't who they were before, but this is who they are now. And because of who they are now, they need to learn lessons from that history. And so Paul has told the first part of that story of the Exodus and the wandering in the wilderness. Now he's going to talk about the other side of that story. God delivers these people from slavery, for heaven's sakes, 400 years of slavery. They get out into the wilderness, and the very first thing these people do is turn their backs on this God who has saved their bacon. Right? That's exactly what's happened. This is the way you say it in church, okay? He saved their bacon, okay? Right? He has saved their bacon, and the very first thing they do is turn their backs on him. This is their God. He's just done this incredibly amazing thing for him, and the very first thing they do is, Baptists would say, backslide. Okay? That's the issue. That's the question for the first century Corinthians, right? You have come to Christ. Who are you to think that you are not susceptible to going back to the old ways? That's what those who were strong in the faith were saying. We're not susceptible to that anymore. It's fine for us to do whatever we want with the pagans, right? Paul gives 4 examples here, and I outline them for you. And this is all stolen from the commentators that I use. But if you go to item number 10, A, B, C, and D, Paul says that for the brand new community of Israel, even after God had saved their bacon, the first thing to do is make the golden calf, and they go over into idolatry again. So he says, to the First Corinthians, the implication is you are susceptible to backsliding just like they did. Then he goes to the next point. He says, when people began to worship, the people of Israel, this is their history, they began to worship idols again, and they intermarried with all of the pagan peoples, he said. And they lost their identity as the people of God. The next point, item C, is an allusion to Numbers 21. The people complain to God, right? God has just given them manna, God has just given them water, and the very next day they're hungry and thirsty again, and they start saying, well, who is this God? He's not taking care of us today. And then they continue to complain about God. This is his 4th point. They continue to complain about God, and they turn away from God. And the result of all of that, as the story is told of the wandering in the wilderness, is God says to all the slaves that he has delivered from Egyptian bondage, he says, you're going to wander in the wilderness until you learn who I am. And all of you who are so prone to faithlessness, to turning towards me and then turning away, you are all going to die away, and a new generation is going to rise up that I will take into the promised land. That's Paul's way of saying to the first century Corinthians that don't think that you are so spiritually strong that you are not susceptible at every point along the way to losing your faith. And that's also a warning to us. Now, Paul will say, God is powerful, God is strong, God can keep you strong and pure as you continue to turn to him. Yes, when God tests you or when life tests you, you do have spiritual resources available to you to remain strong and faithful. But that doesn't mean that you're not at risk. You are at risk. And so living the Christian life is not a once and for all decision and deal that says, I decided a long time ago, therefore everything's fine. No, it's an everyday challenge. And we are always confronted with the possibility of turning away from God. Just like the very first believers, if you will, like the first people who were saved by God and wandered in the wilderness. Okay? Paul then goes on to talk about the meal, right? One of the meals were incredibly important in the first century. They still are in many cultures and societies. And in a sense, they're still important to us too, right? When you meet somebody and you want to get to know them, or you have an old friend and you want to get to be with them, what's the first thing you do? You say, let's go out to eat together, okay? In the Middle Eastern world, it was very true then, and it still is true today, that you don't invite just anybody to come sit down and have a meal with you. You invite your friends, you invite your family. If there's somebody new, you check them out for a while. You make a decision whether or not you're going to include them, right? I've been watching a Netflix series that goes back into Judaism in the early part of the 1900s through the middle part. And there's a whole lot of romance stuff that goes on. And in one of the romance stories that's going on, the girl has just now decided that it's okay to invite her boyfriend to come meet her family, right? That's tantamount to being invited to the table, okay? Paul begins to talk about the significance of the table, the significance of breaking bread there. And he says that, when you sit down to eat with somebody, it's not just about taking in nourishment. There's a whole lot more that goes on, okay? For the pagan world, to sit down and eat together was a way to celebrate their fellowship, their community, right? That's part of what that was. That's also what it is for Christians when we sit down and eat the meal together. From the get-go, baptism and the Lord's Supper, the communion meal together with each other, were what defined and brought together the Christian community. Paul says, when you're eating a meal with somebody else in some other religious, social, political context, some other cultural context, there are things that are going on in that are not just about eating with each other. They are about what is fundamentally important to you. And he goes so far as to say that when you eat a meal with others, you are eating to the Lord, but they are eating to demons, right? One of the Corinthians' arguments with Paul, and it's a logical thing to think about, was to say that we now know that there's only one true God. There's only one God who exists. We worship this God, right? Pagans worship gods who are no gods. They don't exist. Why should we worry about worshiping with gods that don't exist? And Paul would agree, yeah, their God doesn't exist. However, there are demons in the world. We don't have time to go into a conversation about demons themselves, okay? But let's look at it this way, that there is evil in the world. There is evil present, always there, waiting for you, okay? And so when we do something with somebody who does not have the same knowledge that we have about the truth of God, we are opening ourselves to the presence of this evil, this alternative way of looking at things that is the wrong way. It's the disastrous way. It's not the way of God. And so Paul points out the danger that is there for younger, newer, weaker Christians, as well as for the oldest, the most mature among them. That evil always exists out there. And in the eating of the meal, we have to be so careful because the meal is so important in terms of what it signifies for our fellowship and for our being together. And then Paul continues the conversation to talk about the specific food, okay, the meat, if you will. What happened in the ancient world, this is true in Judaism as well as in the pagan world, one of the ways that you worship is to sacrifice animals, okay? If you sacrifice a dove, you've got some meat there. You might eat the dove, you're done. If you sacrifice a sheep or a ram or a bull, you got more than you can eat that day, right? And you don't wrap it up and put it in the freezer for later on. What do you do with all that leftover food? Okay? So There were ritual rules about how you ate the food, when you ate the food, all that kind of thing. But what do you do with all that leftover food? One of the things that happened in the pagan world was that all this leftover food would just be taken out to the marketplace and sold. Okay? And so, you go down to a seaside market and ask for their luscious ribs or whatever, and off you go. There's a problem though for the Christians, and the problem arises partly out of the background and history of faith. For the Jews, for classic Orthodox Jews who had all these dietary restrictions, it was simply impermissible in any context, in any situation, to eat any food that had been sacrificed to idols, whether it was in the context of a ritual worship meal or not. If that food had somehow been tainted, these are kosher laws in some sense, then you would never come close to it. And so for some of the first Christians, that was their attitude and that approach. Yeah, we're just going over to have, burgers and shrimp on the grill, and the food might have been, it came from this source, but that's not why we're eating it now. Some would say, we can't eat it. We shouldn't eat it. Others would say, it's okay, it's just food. And what does Paul say? Here he draws a very fine point, and here's where we see the continued application of deep theological truth to very specific circumstances that arise in the life of the church, and those kinds of dynamics still exist with us today. Paul says, for those of you who are just eating and you have no problem with it having been sacrificed to idols, he says that's fine, because we know that idols don't exist. And by implication, nothing has actually happened with that. You think something happened with it because you worship the idol that this was dedicated to, but if the idol doesn't even exist, then it's meat is just meat. Go ahead and eat. However, there are some for whom that still is tainted with the overtone of idol worship. And so Paul says, when you go to eat somewhere, and everybody says, let's just eat, everything's fine. He says, fine, go ahead. Because everything was made by God anyway. It's just stuff that God made for you. The meat itself, there's nothing significant about the meat itself other than it's a gift of God. Okay? But if someone pulls you aside and says, that was sacrificed to idols, that's where it came from. They didn't go to Seaside Market, right? They went to someplace else. Then that's saying to you that for that person, that meat is evil. It's going to lead you into evil. And so out of your conscience, your concern for the other person in the family of the church, you're not going to eat that meat. Does that make sense to you? Paul's being very specific in this. In this way, Paul is going beyond the traditional understanding of food that is sacrificed to idols. Okay? And that was a question, not just with food, but everything else, right? All of these folks that are coming into faith, they have their own traditions and histories about how they will practice the faith. And Paul is applying a new standard and a new way of looking at that, right? Now, we don't so much think about food sacrificed to idols anymore, but we do think about things like alcohol, things like dancing and playing cards and wearing pants to church. And all of those things. All of us come from traditions and histories that say, this is the way you do church. And even though we know that none of that is necessarily sacred to God, we're still hung up with that stuff, right? Church is only church if you're using the King James Version of the Bible. Church is only church if you're singing out of a hymn book. Church is only church if fill in the blanks, right? And so this is a present question for us today. Again, Paul's biggest concerns are about making sure the community of the church stays together. He's concerned about making sure that faith is nurtured and encouraged, and that we make room for another person's faith and their faithful expression. Even though we might not be bound by some things with a higher understanding, still we have to be careful with the feelings of others and help nurture and bring them along. We have to be very careful about our interaction with the non-Christian world, with the non-faithful world, because even though we think we're strong, we're not as strong as we think we are. Who are we to presume that we cannot fall to temptation? Because people all the way along in the history of the church, in the history of God's faithful people, they fall to temptation. So these are the issues and the matters that are before us. Paul then ends by saying, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And he's holding up the fact, he's lifting up the idea that those who believe have a responsibility to nurture and encourage those who don't believe and those who are young in their belief, to bring them along in that, right? And so that's where he leaves us in this conversation. Let me stop there. Let's get the microphone out and talk about your questions, your comments, your observations for a few minutes here. Okay, right over here. Who's got the mic? Okay, go, run.
Thank you. Can you tell us what that series is that you're watching? It sounds kind of interesting.
That's great. It is called The Beauty Queen of Jerusalem. And it's we're getting it on Netflix. And it's based, I haven't read the book that it's based on. It moves fairly slowly, but it is a fascinating look at a traditional Jewish family in Jerusalem in the teens and 20s and 30s. And we're about 10 or 11 episodes into it. There's violence and sex and all that other kind of stuff that normally occurs, but it's a fascinating look at the culture. There's some there's dynamics that exist when this Jewish family is from this particular sect of Judaism. There's interaction with other sects of Judaism that are not always positive. There's some of the stuff going on between the Jewish-Arab stuff. There's lots of background, but I'm finding it fascinating. Yeah. Any other TV recommendations that you read? No? Yes. Yeah.
The phrase in the passage, being baptized unto Moses, I believe you've explained that in this process, but I want to confirm that.
Yeah. Baptized into Moses means, Paul in that whole section there in the opening of chapter 10, Paul is making lots of analogical comparisons between historical events and physical things and taking them into a spiritual translation. And by baptized into Moses, what he really means to say is that all of those people who followed Moses, followed Moses not just to literally leave Egypt, but they followed Moses into a relationship with God, By following Moses, they were following this God who was their God, but they had long since forgotten about him, right? They followed Moses into this new, deeper relationship with God. In that sense, baptized into Moses. Paul would never say that Moses was God. I mean, now we're talking, you were baptized into the name of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. But baptized into Moses more is baptized into the way of belief and thinking of Moses himself. Does that make sense to you? Yeah, thank you for lifting that up. Paul's language here, he says you're eating spiritual food and drinking spiritual water. Well, first century Corinthians and us, we didn't actually eat the manna. We didn't actually drink the water. So God didn't literally feed us and water us. But spiritually speaking, right, God was doing more than just feeding and watering. God was nurturing the spiritual relationship between the people and God. And we still can we, first century Christians, and we can still take spiritual sustenance from knowing about God sustaining them back then. Their history becomes our history. Jews would even go so far to say, and in a sense, I think Christians also should say, in the traditional Seder meal, and this is ordered in the book of Deuteronomy, teach this to your sons and to your sons' sons. When you sit down to eat this meal, what do you say? I was a slave in Egypt. Meaning the current generation. This might be 30 years ago, it might be 300 years ago, it might be 3,000 years ago, but no, I was a slave in Egypt. You take on that identity of having been a slave. All of that is present there in a spiritual sense. So, thank you for lifting that up. Yeah. Someone else. Cool. What I want you to think about, let's leave it here. What I want you to think about is the fact that just like first century Christians, just like the Jews, I mean, at the very beginning, we live in a world that's full of people and full of situations that are not pure, that are not Christian, that are not oriented in the way that we are oriented. How do we live in that world? Some people would answer that by saying we just withdraw from the world and we create our own little version of that world. The church has tried that over and over and over again. And what happens is that two people agree that they're going to move off somewhere where there's nobody else, and they're going to create their own perfect little version of life in heaven. And then what historically has happened is they start arguing with each other. And it's hard, right? You can't live even in the life of the church. And so how do we live in life outside of the church, outside of Christian community and context, and maintain the purity of our faith and our belief and our practice, what we actually do in life, and yet live in a way that respects others, in a way that includes others, in a way that invites others into this kind of life? It's hard enough to do it within the church. It's even harder outside the church. But that's the world we live in, and we're called to live in that world. And so we are called to be part of that. This conversation is just as modern today, even though it comes out of very old thought forms and very old history that a lot of people don't even know about anymore. It still is a modern conversation today. Okay, we will leave 1 Corinthians at this point, but we won't leave God because we got to get Jesus here soon, okay? All right, let's have a prayer together. Lord, thanks for being with us in this study time and the sharing time. Be with us as we meet with our small groups. Be with us as we wrap packages for little kids and as we come to sing your praises and as we go out into the world to do your work. Be with us for Jesus' sake. Amen. God bless.